But anyway, speaking of monopolies, there's a whole nother the growing monopolies on the AI side with OpenAI and Anthropic and the handful of the next generation of big tech companies. And there's been some interesting movement about something that we've been talking about for a long time, because of course we're very, very smart and see everything happening before it happens. But we've been talking a lot about the small language model and the mid-sized language models and why, from an operationalization and from an enterprise perspective, they may actually be more relevant. And there's some news this week, actually a whole bunch of little news pieces that are all sort of pointing in that direction. So I don't know if you want to go down that road.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see that on the one hand, you see the likes of Elon Musk and Meta working on these hundreds of billions of parameter large language models. And those are going to be obviously complex and probably provide great results, to be quite honest. But they're also going to be extremely compute intensive. So it looks like there's a lot of effort right now to create smaller models that can be practically deployed in enterprise projects. And we're seeing that both with OpenAI announcing their GPT 4.0 mini, which is an 8 billion parameter model, and we're also seeing Mistral come out with its Mistral Nemo, which is a 12 billion parameter model, both with 128K context length windows and basically providing very high level answers, with similar performance, not quite as good as their parent models might be, but on par with what people have been seeing from a generative AI perspective.
Yeah, what I think was interesting. So I'll keep the two other ones that one that you brought up and one that I did, and that is a announcement by Vectara that they've raised $25 million for a purpose-built Mockingbird, with a purpose-built LLM called Mockingbird, specifically for enterprise RAG applications, and then a Wall Street Journal article that was talking about the fact that these enterprises are in fact starting to focus on these smaller and mid-sized language models. And what was interesting about both of these stories, and the reason I'm bringing up in this context, is to sort of juxtapose them to the OpenAI and the Mistral. So OpenAI and Mistral, they are smaller. I don't know, I guess we'd call these mid-sized language models, smaller language models. And they're really, the only purpose is to reduce cost. And I guess speed, but I think like the big ones are still outperforming them from a speed perspective. So it's really about reducing the resource load. And the challenge I have with that is it's like I struggle with, well, when do I use which? Like I use this tool called Raycast, and I have access to like 14 different models across this
Mhm.
entire spectrum. And I really struggle about like, when do I switch? When do I use one versus the other? Because there's so little differentiation, at least that's exposed. And again, you and I, we spend a lot of time doing this. I can't imagine someone who doesn't interact with this, like having any clue what to do with it. And so, in fairness, the 4.0 mini is, at least if I'm understanding, it's accessible only by API. So they're obviously catering this to developers to say this is a cheaper way to get access to some of these use cases. But I brought up these other two stories because where I actually think this is going to end up is the way those stories are indicating. And these are companies that are building purpose-built smaller LLMs to solve a specific use case. And so one of the quotes in the Wall Street Journal article was, I don't necessarily need to understand, who Shakespeare is and all the sonnets and be able to do that if I'm trying to solve for the specific use case. So let's define the use case and train the model to that point. And that's a lot of what we heard from the Snowflake and the Databricks idea of you're building custom LLMs. And so I look at that and I think that's the better approach. So I'm a little iffy is maybe not the right word, but it just like I don't, simply making a smaller parameter model, which is what OpenAI and Mistral are doing by themselves, I don't think is necessarily the best approach. I think it's this nuanced, targeted application, which I think is going to deliver better results.
Yeah, I'm excited about what's happening with generative AI models right now because it seems like there's a lot of opportunities to make things more efficient and to figure out how to get the same results with a tenth of the effort. So, and there's multiple areas where we could get an 80 to 90% improvements. And this is one of them, looking at, say, an 8 billion parameter model instead of a 100 billion parameter model, and the compute efficiencies you get along with that. Perhaps that also means we can actually improve the efficiency of our storage and compute as we start figuring out which aspects of the processing actually affect the chips and the storage involved. We might be able to affect the models themselves from a mathematical perspective, as we've covered before, as UC Santa Cruz is working on, from an academic perspective. So all these pieces are coming together to start transforming these models from something that seems to require a glass of water to cool down the computer every time you do a query to something where a prompt starts becoming much more like a standard request from a computing perspective.
Yeah, I also think so. I think we're going to have this very nuanced sort of, or what we're seeing develop is this much more nuanced view of this, right? Because I also think, and like I know I mentioned I use a system and I have different. Well, one of the ways I tune my models is I use the llama model, which is what comes to be a perplexity, which is tuned for search.
Mhm.
Um, when I'm doing things where it's like I'm looking for information and I want to be able to understand the sources so I can validate this on my own, versus I tend to use either Open ChatGPT 4.0 or Anthropic Cloud 3.5 when I'm looking for brainstorming and I'm trying to kind of go more creatively. And what I think is interesting is the Mockingbird LLM. The focus here is RAG, and where I'm a little bit concerned is not the right word, but where I want to understand more is that they are calling this grounded search, and I think that we're gonna we've talked a lot about this in the past. Is that in the end, what we're going to find is that LLMs and generative AI is not the end all be all.
Yes.
And the big question is this whole approach that they're taking even going to be the right one in the end? Because it's like when I use AI for search, I'm very circumspect. I'm very careful about, depending on what I'm looking for, how I'm digging into that. And the whole point of this approach that they're taking is to try to reduce the level of hallucination and to try to make it more reliable for enterprise search. But I put my CIO hat on. It's like I don't know if I'm going to go there at all. It just really concerns me, um, because you know, I like I said, I use it every day, but I've had to give me just some bizarre answers, you know. So I need the ability to go check it, and so I'm really kind of curious as to how these use cases are developing, and I think that's going to be the real battles as this plays out is where these use cases sort of get placed and how people are applying them.
Right. So all these standalone models that are being created by the likes of Mistral and OpenAI, of course, when we are using them from an enterprise use case, we are probably going to be doing some level of fine tuning or retrieval augmented generation. And this startup called Vectara, started by former Cloudera CTO Amr Awadallah, they've been working on this, what they call grounded search. It's a version of retrieval augmented generation. They've been doing their flavor of it for a couple of years. And it's interesting how they are trying to work on making this more fine tuned, so that it focuses on facts and can't be pulled off of the facts as easily as some generative AI models can be. We've all probably, if you've played with generative AI, you know that you can start fudging the answer if you start bullying the model or giving assumptions that may not have any actual factual grounding to them. The model will just accept what you're saying if it doesn't have anything to push back against. And that's part of what Vectara is trying to work on with their specific Mockingbird LLM. And they're trying to provide some help so that you can see explanations associated with answers and that you can be protected against prompt attacks. So if you're in the middle of a discussion, you can't accidentally get some prompt slipped in from a third party that suddenly messes up everything that you're doing. That those are the types of problems that they're working on, and I think at least that's the right direction to be going from a generative AI perspective. That we need to be thinking about the security issues associated with AI, just like we've been dealing with data security issues so much in the recent weeks. Um, Whether this is the right way to go, or whether there are better upstream or downstream solutions for AI, that's still very much a question that requires answers. Honestly, I keep saying this over and over again, but I still think of this as such early days for generative AI, just because we have been on the hype cycle for this for almost 2 years doesn't mean that we've figured out all the answers or that all of this is 100% enterprise ready.
Yeah, and I'm probably being too hard on it because the reality is we don't have anything else right now. But I will say that and maybe it is. I'm always just wary of the hype and of the big proclamations. Um, but I'm a believer of RAG. I'm a believer of this idea of you know opening it up so that we don't have this in a black box, so we can see what's going on and understanding what's happening. And I do think we have some amazing use cases. I guess the way I look at this is it's really about, and maybe the big message in all of these stories for me is focus on the use case, focus on the problem you're trying to solve, and then see if you can get enough confidence in the ability of whatever LLM or whatever technology you're using to drive it. And the one thing I wish that I would continue to see more of, and maybe this is what kind of triggered me a little bit, is as we've said a thousand times so far on here, right? Generative AI is not the only form of AI. We were preceded by many other forms of machine learning predictive models that I think one of the best ways to stop hallucinations is to merge these together, is to bring in these other elements that are not solely reliant on the generative pieces. And I think that will go a long way, which is part of what RAG is, right? Part of what RAG is trying to do. But I think that's the big takeaway, as we've talked about before, of not getting swept up in all of it.